In the split second before Lieutenant Commander Marcus Sullivan's fist connected with the Royal Guard's jaw, time seemed to freeze. The ornate palace corridor, filled with diplomats and officials, fell silent except for the distant sound of ceremonial drums echoing through marble halls. What had started as a routine diplomatic escort mission was about to become an international incident that would shake the foundations of military protocol and royal tradition. Sullivan knew the consequences would be severe. Striking a member of the Royal Guard wasn't just insubordination. It was an act that could spark a diplomatic crisis between two allied nations. But, as he watched the guard's hand move toward the concealed weapon at his waist, threatening the safety of the ambassador's daughter, Sullivan made a choice that would define not only his military career, but his understanding of what honor truly means. This is the true story of one man's split-second decision that echoed through palace halls, military tribunals, and the pages of diplomatic history. It's a story about courage, consequence, and the thin line between duty and justice that every service member must walk. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Sullivan stood at attention in the briefing room of Naval Station Norfolk, his dress blues pressed to perfection. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where Admiral Richardson sat reviewing classified documents. At 34, Sullivan had earned his reputation as one of the Navy's most reliable officers, with 12 years of distinguished service including 3 deployments and a commendation for excellence in diplomatic security operations. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Ambassador William Hartley, the United States ambassador to the Kingdom of Valdoria, required a military escort for a high-profile diplomatic mission to the royal palace. The occasion was the signing of a new trade agreement between the two nations, a deal worth billions of dollars that would strengthen economic ties and military cooperation for decades to come. What made this mission particularly sensitive was that Ambassador Hartley would be accompanied by his 19-year-old daughter, Sarah, who was studying international relations and had been granted special permission to observe the proceedings as part of her academic research. Admiral Richardson looked up from his papers, his weathered face bearing the marks of 30 years at sea. "Sullivan, this isn't your typical security detail. The Kingdom of Valdoria has very specific protocols when it comes to foreign military personnel on their soil. You'll be working alongside their Royal Guard. And I want to be crystal clear about something. You're there to observe and protect our people, not to enforce American military standards on their territory." Sullivan nodded, though something in the Admiral's tone suggested there was more to this warning than standard diplomatic courtesy. He had worked with foreign security forces before, and, while cultural differences sometimes created friction, professional military personnel typically found common ground in their shared commitment to protection and order. The briefing continued with detailed information about the palace layout, security procedures, and the specific schedule of events. The ceremony would take place in the palace's Grand Hall, a magnificent room that had witnessed the signing of treaties and royal proclamations for over 3 centuries. The Royal Guard would handle perimeter security and palace protection, while Sullivan's role would focus specifically on the ambassador and his daughter during their time in the building. Captain Morrison, the base's intelligence officer, spread out architectural drawings of the palace on the table. "The Royal Guard has been in charge of palace security for generations," he explained. "They're trained from childhood, and they take their duties very seriously. Their commander, Colonel Victor Antonoff, served in their special forces before joining the Guard. He's known to be traditional in his approach to security matters." The photos in Sullivan's briefing packet showed an imposing man in his 40s wearing the distinctive crimson and gold uniform of the Royal Guard. Colonel Antonoff's military record was impressive, with decorations from 3 different conflicts and a reputation for absolute loyalty to the royal family. However, the intelligence reports also mentioned his rigid adherence to protocol and a particular distrust of foreign security personnel, whom he viewed as potential threats to royal sovereignty. 2 days later, Sullivan found himself on a military transport plane crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The Kingdom of Valdoria was a small European nation nestled between larger powers, but its strategic location and rich cultural heritage made it an important ally. The country had maintained its monarchy for over 800 years, adapting to modern times while preserving ancient traditions that defined its national identity. As the plane descended toward the capital city, Sullivan reviewed his notes one final time. The Royal Guard operated under a strict hierarchy that traced its origins back to medieval times. Guard members were selected based on family lineage, physical prowess, and absolute dedication to protecting the crown. They underwent years of specialized training that combined modern security techniques with traditional martial arts and weapons training passed down through generations. The airport security detail that met Sullivan's plane was courteous but thorough. His diplomatic passport and military credentials were examined multiple times, and his luggage was searched with meticulous attention to detail. The Royal Guard officer who processed his entry spoke perfect English, but maintained the formal distance that seemed to characterize all official interactions in the kingdom. Ambassador Hartley met Sullivan at the embassy, a beautiful building that served as the headquarters for American diplomatic operations in Valdoria. The ambassador was a career diplomat in his late 50s, with the polished demeanor that came from decades of navigating complex international relationships. His daughter Sarah was bright and enthusiastic, clearly excited about the opportunity to witness high-level diplomacy firsthand. During their initial meeting, Ambassador Hartley expressed some concerns about the upcoming ceremony. The Royal Guard has been unusually strict about security measures, he explained. They've implemented new protocols that seem designed to limit our movement and access within the palace. Colonel Antonoff has made it clear that he views any foreign security presence as a necessary inconvenience at best. Sullivan asked about the specific nature of these new protocols, and the ambassador's expression grew troubled. They've insisted on conducting their own security screening of our entire delegation, including Sarah. They want to interview each person individually and review all personal belongings. It's far more invasive than anything we've encountered in previous diplomatic visits. Sarah Hartley added her own observations from the preliminary meetings she had attended. Some of the Guard members seem almost hostile when they look at us, she said. Not threatening exactly, but like they're just waiting for us to do something wrong so they can prove we don't belong there. The evening before the ceremony, Sullivan conducted his own security assessment of the palace grounds. The building was indeed magnificent, with towering spires and elaborate stonework that spoke to centuries of royal grandeur. The Royal Guard was highly visible throughout the complex, with sentries posted at regular intervals and patrol teams moving through the corridors in precise formations. What concerned Sullivan was the apparent lack of coordination between the Guard's security measures and standard diplomatic protocols. Normal security arrangements would involve detailed communication between all protection teams, shared intelligence about potential threats, and coordinated response procedures. Instead, the Royal Guard seemed determined to operate in isolation, treating the American delegation more like potential security risks than distinguished guests. Sullivan's attempts to establish professional contact with Guard members were met with polite but firm resistance. They answered his questions about basic procedures, but refused to discuss any details about their security arrangements or emergency protocols. When he asked to meet with Colonel Antonoff directly, he was told that the colonel would address all security matters personally during the ceremony itself. As Sullivan prepared for sleep in his embassy quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this assignment was fundamentally different from his previous diplomatic security missions. The tension he sensed wasn't just cultural formality or professional territoriality. There was an underlying current of suspicion and hostility that seemed to go beyond normal security concerns. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that tomorrow's ceremony held the potential for serious problems. The Royal Guard's behavior suggested they viewed the American delegation not as allies to be protected, but as threats to be contained. In an environment where split-second decisions could have international consequences, that kind of mistrust was a recipe for disaster. Sullivan spent his final hours before the mission reviewing emergency protocols and contingency plans, hoping he was wrong about his growing sense of unease. He had no way of knowing that Colonel Antonoff was conducting his own final preparations that included detailed plans for dealing with what he considered the inevitable security breach that foreign military presence would create. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only military protocols and diplomatic traditions, but the fundamental question of where loyalty and duty truly lie when they come into conflict with justice and human decency. Tomorrow would bring answers that no amount of training or preparation could have anticipated. The morning of the ceremony dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror Sullivan's growing apprehension. He arrived at the embassy at dawn to conduct final security checks and coordinate with Ambassador Hartley's staff. The delegation would consist of 6 people, the ambassador and his daughter, 2 senior embassy officials, a trade specialist, and Sullivan himself as security escort. Sarah Hartley appeared nervous, but excited as she reviewed her notes about the treaty signing. She had written extensively about the historical significance of the trade agreement, and was particularly interested in observing how diplomatic protocols had evolved over centuries of royal tradition. Her academic enthusiasm was infectious, and Sullivan found himself hoping that the day would proceed smoothly enough for her to gain the educational experience she was seeking. The embassy motorcade arrived at the palace gates at precisely 10 in the morning, as scheduled. The Royal Guard checkpoint was more elaborate than Sullivan had expected, with multiple layers of security screening that seemed designed more for theater than practical protection. Each member of the American delegation was required to present identification multiple times, submit to metal detector screening, and answer questions about their purpose and background. Colonel Antonoff himself supervised the entry process, his imposing figure unmistakable in the elaborate dress uniform of his rank. He was taller than his photograph suggested, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the American visitors. When Sullivan presented his credentials, Antonoff studied them for a long moment before looking directly into his eyes. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," Antonoff said in heavily accented English, "you will observe our protocols exactly as instructed. Any deviation from approved procedures will result in immediate removal from the palace grounds." His tone made it clear that this was not a request or suggestion, but a direct order despite Sullivan's independent command authority. Sullivan maintained his professional composure while noting the unusual hostility in Antonoff's manner. In previous diplomatic missions, foreign security commanders had typically treated visiting military personnel with mutual respect, even when maintaining strict control over their movements. Antonoff's approach suggested a personal animosity that went beyond normal security concerns. The palace interior was breathtaking, with marble corridors adorned with priceless artwork and tapestries that chronicled 8 centuries of royal history. The American delegation was escorted through a series of reception rooms where they met with various officials and diplomatic representatives from other allied nations. The atmosphere was formal but cordial, with the easy conversation that characterizes experienced diplomatic professionals. What troubled Sullivan was the behavior of the Royal Guard members assigned to monitor the delegation's movement. Instead of maintaining discreet observation positions, they stayed uncomfortably close to the Americans, following them from room to room in a manner that felt more like surveillance than protection. When Sullivan attempted to position himself strategically to observe potential security concerns, Guard members quickly moved to block his view or redirect his attention. The tension became more apparent during the pre-ceremony reception in the palace's Blue Room, where diplomats and officials mingled over formal refreshments. Sarah Hartley was engaged in animated conversation with a young attaché from the British Embassy about comparative government systems when 2 Royal Guard members positioned themselves directly behind her chair. Their presence was so obvious and intimidating that the conversation gradually died away, leaving Sarah looking confused and uncomfortable. Sullivan approached one of the guards and politely suggested that their positioning might be making the diplomatic guests feel unwelcome. The guard member, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, responded with barely concealed contempt. "We position ourselves as ordered by Colonel Antonoff. Your concerns are noted but irrelevant." The word irrelevant hung in the air like a challenge. Sullivan had worked with dozens of foreign military units throughout his career, and he had never encountered such deliberate disrespect from a professional soldier. Something about this situation was fundamentally wrong, but the formal diplomatic setting made it impossible to address the issue directly without creating an international incident. Ambassador Hartley noticed the growing tension and approached Sullivan with obvious concern. "Is there a problem with security arrangements?" he asked quietly. Sullivan briefed him on the unusual behavior patterns he had observed, and the ambassador's expression grew troubled. "I've been sensing something similar," Hartley said. "Colonel Antonoff seems determined to treat us as unwelcome guests rather than diplomatic allies. I've tried to address the matter through normal channels, but palace protocol officers keep referring me back to Guard authority for all security matters." The situation took a more serious turn when the delegation was escorted to the Grand Hall for the treaty signing ceremony. The magnificent room could accommodate several hundred people, with tiered seating arranged around a central stage where the actual signing would take place. Representatives from multiple nations were present, along with members of the royal family, government officials, and selected media representatives. Colonel Antonoff had positioned Royal Guard members throughout the hall in a manner that seemed designed to maximize their visibility rather than optimize security coverage. Sullivan noticed several obvious gaps in their formation that would allow potential threats to approach the VIP area without detection. When he discreetly pointed this out to a senior guard officer, he was told that American military personnel were not authorized to comment on Royal Guard procedures. The ceremony began with traditional pageantry that showcased the kingdom's rich cultural heritage. Military bands played stirring marches while honor guards presented ceremonial weapons and banners that had been carried into battle centuries before. The pageantry was impressive, but Sullivan remained focused on security considerations that seemed increasingly problematic. Sarah Hartley was seated in the designated diplomatic section, where she took careful notes about the proceedings for her academic research. Sullivan maintained a position where he could observe both her location and the general security situation in the hall. What he saw made his concerns grow more acute by the minute. Royal Guard members were paying far more attention to the American delegation than to potential security threats from other areas of the hall. Their focus seemed almost obsessive, as if they expected the Americans to pose some kind of threat to the proceedings. Sullivan began to suspect that Colonel Antonoff had briefed his men to treat the American military presence as a hostile force to be contained rather than allies to be accommodated. The treaty signing itself proceeded with elaborate formality, as government ministers from both nations affixed their signatures to documents that would govern trade relationships for years to come. The symbolism was powerful, representing centuries of diplomatic tradition adapting to meet modern economic realities. For most observers, it was a celebration of international cooperation and mutual prosperity. But Sullivan was increasingly aware that something was building toward a crisis. The Royal Guard's behavior had moved beyond mere hostility into what could only be described as active provocation. Guard members were positioning themselves to block his sight lines, responding to his professional communications with barely concealed contempt, and treating the American delegation with a level of suspicion that bordered on paranoia. The breaking point came during the post-ceremony reception, when distinguished guests mingled in the palace's crystal ballroom. Sarah Hartley was examining a historical display about previous diplomatic treaties when a Royal Guard member approached her with obvious aggressive intent. Sullivan watched from across the room as the guard began what appeared to be an unauthorized interrogation, demanding to know why she was taking notes and insisting on examining her personal belongings. Ambassador Hartley moved to intervene, but two more guard members blocked his path while their colleague continued his increasingly hostile questioning of Sarah. The young woman looked frightened and confused, clearly uncertain about her rights in this situation and unable to understand why she was being treated as a security threat. Sullivan realized that the situation was deteriorating rapidly beyond the bounds of normal diplomatic protocol. Whatever Colonel Antonoff's motivations might be, his guard members were now actively harassing American diplomatic personnel without justification or authorization from higher palace authority. The incident was occurring in full view of diplomatic representatives from multiple nations, creating the potential for a major international embarrassment. As Sullivan moved across the ballroom toward the developing confrontation, he could see Colonel Antonoff watching from a distance with apparent satisfaction. The colonel made no move to intervene or control his subordinates' behavior, suggesting that the harassment was occurring with his full knowledge and approval. Sullivan's training had prepared him for many types of security challenges, but this situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. The Royal Guard's behavior represented a deliberate provocation that seemed designed to create exactly the kind of incident that would justify their apparent hostility toward American military presence. He was walking into a trap, but he could not stand by and watch a 19-year-old American citizen being intimidated and harassed by foreign military personnel. The next few minutes would test everything Sullivan believed about duty, honor, and the responsibilities that came with wearing his country's uniform. His decision to act would set in motion a chain of events that would echo through military tribunals, diplomatic conferences, and the conscience of everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold in the crystal ballroom of an ancient royal palace. Sullivan moved through the crowded ballroom with measured steps, his military training automatically calculating distances, exit routes, and potential complications as the situation unfolded before him. The Royal Guard member questioning Sarah Hartley had become increasingly aggressive, his voice rising above the polite murmur of diplomatic conversation that filled the ornate room. Other guests were beginning to notice the confrontation, their conversations faltering as they turned to observe what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable incident. The guard member, whose nameplate identified him as Sergeant Kozlov, was now demanding that Sarah surrender her notebook and explain each entry she had made during the ceremony. His English was heavily accented, but perfectly clear as he accused her of conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering on royal security procedures. Sarah's face had gone pale, her academic enthusiasm replaced by obvious fear as she tried to explain that her notes were purely educational and related to her studies in international relations. Ambassador Hartley's attempts to reach his daughter were being systematically blocked by 2 additional Guard members who had positioned themselves to prevent his intervention. The ambassador's diplomatic training kept his voice calm and measured, but Sullivan could see the growing anger in his eyes as he found himself unable to protect his own child from what was clearly becoming harassment rather than legitimate security questioning. "Excuse me, Sergeant," Sullivan said as he approached the group, his tone carefully neutral despite his growing concern. "Perhaps I could assist in resolving any security concerns. I'm Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, military escort for the American delegation." Sergeant Kozlov turned towards Sullivan with undisguised hostility. "This matter does not concern American military personnel. You will step back and allow Royal Guard to conduct necessary security procedures." Sullivan maintained his professional composure while noting several troubling details about the situation. Kozlov's hand rested on the grip of his ceremonial weapon. His body language was aggressive rather than professional, and his backup personnel were positioned more for confrontation than for legitimate security work. Most concerning was the fact that other diplomatic personnel in the immediate area were being ignored, despite carrying similar materials and engaging in identical behavior to Sarah's note-taking. "I understand your security concerns," Sullivan replied carefully, "but Miss Hartley is an American citizen under diplomatic protection. If there are questions about her activities, perhaps we could address them through proper diplomatic channels rather than in this public setting." The conversation was drawing attention from across the ballroom. Sullivan could see other military attaches and security personnel beginning to take notice of the developing situation. More importantly, he could see Colonel Antonoff watching from near the room's main entrance, his expression suggesting satisfaction rather than concern about his subordinates' increasingly aggressive behavior. Sarah Hartley looked between the Royal Guard members and Sullivan with obvious relief that someone was trying to help her, but also growing fear about what the confrontation might mean for her father's diplomatic mission. Her voice was shaky as she tried once again to explain her presence and purpose. "I'm just a student observing the ceremony for my academic research. I have all the proper permissions and credentials." Sergeant Kozlov stepped closer to Sullivan, invading his personal space in a manner clearly designed to provoke a reaction. "American military personnel have no authority on royal property. You will remove yourself from this security matter immediately or face consequences for interference with Royal Guard duties." The threat was unmistakable, and Sullivan realized that the situation had moved far beyond normal diplomatic friction into something approaching a deliberate provocation. Kozlov's behavior suggested he was following orders to create exactly this type of confrontation, using Sarah Hartley as bait to draw Sullivan into an incident that would justify whatever Colonel Antonoff had planned. Sullivan took a small step back, not in retreat, but to create space for de-escalation while maintaining his ability to respond if the situation deteriorated further. His movement seemed to encourage Kozlov, who interpreted it as evidence of American weakness rather than professional restraint. "Your student was observed making detailed notes about security arrangements," Kozlov continued, his voice rising enough to be heard across much of the ballroom. "This constitutes intelligence gathering against royal security interests. She will be detained for questioning until her activities can be properly investigated." The word detained sent alarm bells through Sullivan's mind. Detaining an American citizen without proper legal authority or diplomatic coordination would constitute a serious violation of international law, not to mention the diplomatic immunity that protected all members of their delegation. This was no longer about security concerns. It was about creating an international incident. Ambassador Hartley's diplomatic composure finally cracked as he heard his daughter threatened with detention. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said loudly enough to be heard throughout the immediate area. "Miss Hartley is under diplomatic protection and has committed no violation of any kind. I demand to speak with palace authority immediately." But the 2 Guard members continued to block the ambassador's path, and Sergeant Kozlov seemed emboldened by their support. He reached for Sarah's notebook with obvious intent to confiscate it, causing her to step backward in alarm. Her movement brought her directly against Sullivan, who found himself between the aggressive Guard member and a frightened American citizen who was clearly being targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate security. Sullivan's training included extensive experience in de-escalating tense situations, but every technique he had learned assumed that all parties were acting in good faith and seeking to resolve conflicts through professional communication. Sergeant Kozlov's behavior suggested no interest in resolution, only in escalation. "Sergeant, I'm asking you to step back and allow diplomatic protocols to resolve this situation," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the authority of command despite his technically advisory role. "Miss Hartley poses no security threat, and your current actions are creating a diplomatic incident that serves no one's interests." Instead of stepping back, Kozlov moved closer, now positioned directly in front of Sullivan with his hand prominently displayed on his weapon. "American military personnel will not give orders to Royal Guard on royal property. You will move away from the security subject immediately or be removed by force." The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter as more guests became aware of the confrontation. Sullivan could see diplomatic personnel from multiple nations watching with obvious concern, some beginning to move toward the exits as they recognized the potential for serious escalation. The ceremony that was supposed to celebrate international cooperation was becoming a showcase of exactly the kind of conflict that diplomacy was designed to prevent. Sarah Hartley's notebook fell to the floor as her hands began to shake. She was clearly terrified by the aggressive behavior directed at her, unable to understand why a simple academic exercise had become the center of what appeared to be an international confrontation. Her fear was obvious to everyone in the immediate area, making Sergeant Kozlov's continued aggression appear increasingly unreasonable and unprofessional. Sullivan realized that he was facing a situation with no good options. Backing down would leave an American citizen exposed to what was clearly harassment and potential illegal detention. But responding with any kind of force would create exactly the international incident that Colonel Antonov seemed determined to provoke. As Sullivan weighed his limited options, Sergeant Kozlov made the decision for him. The guard member reached past Sullivan to grab Sarah's arm, apparently intending to forcibly escort her from the ballroom for his threatened questioning. His action was rough and clearly intended to intimidate, causing Sarah to cry out in alarm and pain as his grip tightened on her arm. The sound of Sarah's distress triggered every protective instinct that Sullivan's training and character had developed over his military career. An American citizen under diplomatic protection was being physically assaulted by a foreign military member who had no legal authority for his actions. The situation had crossed the line from diplomatic friction into criminal assault, and Sullivan's responsibility to protect American personnel now superseded all other considerations. Sullivan moved to intercept Kozlov's grip on Sarah's arm, positioning himself between them with clear intent to prevent further assault. "Release her immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his rank and position. "You have no legal authority to detain or assault American diplomatic personnel." Kozlov's response was to tighten his grip on Sarah while reaching for his ceremonial weapon with his free hand. The threat was unmistakable and immediate. A foreign military member was preparing to draw a weapon against American diplomatic personnel in full view of international observers. Sullivan had perhaps 2 seconds to respond before the situation escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. In that frozen moment, Sullivan could see Colonel Antonov beginning to move across the ballroom with what appeared to be anticipation rather than concern. The entire confrontation had been orchestrated to reach exactly this point, where any American response would appear to be unprovoked aggression against royal authority. But as Sullivan watched Kozlov's hand move toward his weapon while maintaining his painful grip on a terrified American citizen, all diplomatic considerations became secondary to the immediate necessity of protecting human life and dignity. His decision was made not by military protocol or diplomatic strategy, but by the fundamental moral obligation that every officer accepts when they swear to defend their country and its citizens. The next few seconds would define not only Sullivan's military career, but his understanding of what duty and honor truly meant when they came into direct conflict with political expediency and international relations, time dilated in the way that combat veterans know well, each second stretching into an eternity of crystal-clear perception and calculated decision-making. Sullivan could see every detail of Sergeant Kozlov's face as the guard member's hand closed around the grip of his ceremonial weapon, could hear Sarah Hartley's frightened breathing, could sense the collective tension of hundreds of diplomatic guests who had suddenly, realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a protocol disagreement. Sullivan's hand moved with the precision of thousands of hours of training, intercepting Kozlov's weapon draw with a defensive block that prevented the blade from clearing its scabbard. The movement was purely protective, designed to neutralize the immediate threat without causing unnecessary harm. But Kozlov's response was to release Sarah and pivot towards Sullivan with obvious aggressive intent, his free hand moving to complete the weapon draw while his body language shifted into a combat stance. The transformation from diplomatic incident to physical confrontation happened in less than 3 seconds. Kozlov's training was evident as he attempted to create distance while bringing his ceremonial sword into play, but his technique betrayed the arrogance that had characterized his entire approach to the situation. He expected Sullivan to retreat, to back down in the face of superior numbers, and the political implications of striking a Royal Guard member on royal property. Instead, Sullivan stepped forward into Kozlov's guard, using proximity to neutralize the weapon advantage while his right hand delivered a precise strike to the guard member's solar plexus. The blow was calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent injury, the kind of controlled force that military police are trained to use when subduing aggressive suspects without excessive harm. Kozlov doubled over from the impact, his weapon clattering to the marble floor as he gasped for breath. The sound of steel hitting stone echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, instantly silencing every conversation as hundreds of eyes turned toward the confrontation. The ceremonial weapon skittered across the polished floor, coming to rest near the feet of a shocked Belgian diplomat who stepped quickly away from the scene. But Sullivan's training had taught him to expect multiple threats in any confrontation, and the 2 guard members who had been blocking Ambassador Hartley immediately moved to support their sergeant. The first reached Sullivan just as Kozlov hit the floor, his approach telegraphed by the distinctive sound of military boots on marble flooring. Sullivan pivoted to meet this new threat, his movement flowing naturally from the defensive posture he had maintained throughout the confrontation. The second guard member was younger and less experienced than Kozlov, his technique relying more on aggression than skill as he attempted to tackle Sullivan around the waist. Sullivan's counter was a textbook defensive move, redirecting the guard member's momentum while delivering an elbow strike to the base of his neck that dropped him immediately to the floor. The third guard member hesitated, clearly recognizing that his 2 colleagues had been neutralized by someone with superior training and experience. His hand moved toward his own weapon, but the hesitation gave Ambassador Hartley the opportunity to finally reach his daughter, who was standing frozen in shock at the center of what had become a combat zone. The entire physical confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its implications would resonate for months to come. 2 Royal Guard members lay unconscious on the ballroom floor, their ceremonial weapons scattered around them like evidence of a battlefield. Sullivan stood over them in a defensive posture, his dress uniform still immaculate despite the violence that had just occurred. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Hundreds of diplomatic guests stood frozen in various poses of shock and disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. An American naval officer had just struck down members of the Royal Guard in full view of international dignitaries, creating exactly the kind of incident that could destabilize diplomatic relationships for years to come. Colonel Antonoff's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of rushing to aid his fallen men or secure the scene for investigation, he began shouting orders in his native language that clearly related to Sullivan's immediate detention. His response suggested less concern for his subordinates' welfare than satisfaction that the confrontation had reached exactly the conclusion he had been seeking. Additional Royal Guard members began converging on the scene from throughout the ballroom, their movements suggesting coordination rather than spontaneous response to an emergency. Sullivan realized that the entire incident had been orchestrated to create exactly this scenario, with himself cast as the aggressor who had assaulted royal security personnel without provocation. Ambassador Hartley moved quickly to establish diplomatic protection around both Sullivan and his daughter, his years of experience allowing him to recognize the political trap that was closing around them. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan was defending American diplomatic personnel from assault. He announced loudly enough to be heard throughout the ballroom. His actions were entirely justified under international law and diplomatic protocol. But Colonel Antonoff was already issuing orders for Sullivan's immediate arrest, claiming that he had committed assault against royal authority and violated the sovereignty of the kingdom. The legal framework for such charges was questionable at best, but the political implications were enormous. Detaining an American naval officer would create an international crisis that could overshadow the trade agreement and damage relationships between allied nations. Sullivan remained in his defensive posture as Royal Guard members surrounded him, his training keeping him alert for additional threats while his mind processed the broader implications of what had just occurred. He had no regrets about his actions. An American citizen had been threatened with illegal detention and physical assault, and he had responded with the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. But he was also realistic about the consequences he now faced. The ballroom began to empty as diplomatic personnel from various nations made hasty exits, clearly recognizing that they did not want to be associated with what was becoming a major international incident. The ceremony that was supposed to celebrate cooperation and friendship had become a showcase of exactly the kind of conflict that diplomacy was designed to prevent. Sarah Hartley was crying now, the combination of fear, shock, and guilt overwhelming her as she realized that her presence had triggered a confrontation that could destroy her father's career and damage her country's international relationships. Ambassador Hartley held her protectively while continuing to assert diplomatic immunity and demand proper legal procedures for any actions taken against American personnel. Palace security personnel began arriving to supplement the Royal Guard, their presence suggesting that word of the incident had already reached the highest levels of kingdom authority. Sullivan could see the wheels of bureaucracy beginning to turn as various officials assessed how to manage the political fallout from an incident that had spiraled far beyond anyone's ability to contain or ignore. Colonel Antonoff approached Sullivan with obvious satisfaction, his earlier hostility now justified in his mind by the American officer's unprovoked assault on royal security personnel. "You will be detained pending investigation of your assault on Royal Guard members," he announced. "Your diplomatic immunity does not protect you from criminal charges related to violence against royal authority." Sullivan maintained his silence, recognizing that anything he said would be used to support whatever narrative Colonel Antonoff chose to construct about the incident. His actions spoke for themselves. The protection of an American citizen from illegal detention and assault. The political consequences were beyond his control, but his conscience was clear about the moral necessity of his response. As Royal Guard members moved to physically detain him, Sullivan could see the broader implications of the confrontation beginning to unfold. News of the incident would reach diplomatic channels within hours, triggering high-level discussions between governments about everything from trade agreements to military cooperation. His split-second decision to protect Sarah Hartley would echo through conference rooms and cabinet meetings in ways that he could never have anticipated. The irony was not lost on him that a ceremony designed to celebrate international friendship had become the stage for a confrontation that threatened to undermine the very relationships it was meant to strengthen. Colonel Antonoff's orchestration had been masterful in its manipulation of cultural tensions and professional protocols, creating a situation where any American response would appear to validate his apparent belief that foreign military presence represented a threat to royal sovereignty. But, as Sullivan felt the handcuffs closing around his wrists, he remained convinced that his actions had been both necessary and right. Military personnel take an oath to defend their country and its citizens, and that oath does not contain exceptions for diplomatic convenience or political expediency. Sarah Hartley's safety had been more important than his career, more important than trade agreements, more important than any of the political calculations that would now dominate discussions about his fate. The next phase of his ordeal would test not only his personal resolve, but his country's commitment to protecting its military personnel when they act in defense of American citizens. The battle in the ballroom was over, but the larger conflict over duty, justice, and international law was just beginning. The detention cell beneath the royal palace was a stark contrast to the opulent ballroom where Sullivan had made his fateful decision just hours earlier. The ancient stone walls and iron bars spoke to centuries of royal justice, while the single window high above provided only a sliver of gray daylight that marked the passage of time in his uncertain new reality. Sullivan sat on the narrow bench that served as the cell's only furniture, his dress uniform now wrinkled but still bearing the insignia that had defined his identity for over a decade. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation had unfolded with the bureaucratic precision that characterizes major international incidents. Palace officials had arrived within minutes to secure the scene, collect witness statements, and begin the complex process of managing a crisis that threatened to overshadow the very trade agreement the ceremony had been designed to celebrate. Ambassador Hartley had been escorted to a secure location for his own protection, while Sarah was taken to the embassy under diplomatic immunity that protected her from Colonel Antoneff's desire for additional questioning. Sullivan's legal situation was complicated by the intersection of diplomatic immunity, military protocol, and royal sovereignty. As a military escort operating under diplomatic orders, he technically enjoyed certain protections under international law. However, Colonel Antoneff's charges of assault against royal authority created jurisdictional questions that would require resolution at the highest levels of government in both nations. The kingdom's foreign minister, a seasoned diplomat named Alexandra Petrov, arrived at the palace within 2 hours of the incident to begin damage control efforts. Her first priority was preventing the confrontation from escalating into a broader diplomatic crisis that could affect military cooperation and trade relationships worth billions of dollars. However, her efforts were complicated by Colonel Antoneff's insistence that Sullivan had committed a serious crime that demanded prosecution under royal law. News of the incident reached Washington within hours through encrypted diplomatic channels. The State Department immediately began consultations with the Defense Department and White House officials about how to respond to the detention of an American naval officer. The political implications were staggering. Abandoning Sullivan to foreign prosecution would send a terrible message to military personnel worldwide, while demanding his immediate release could be seen as American arrogance that disregarded Allied sovereignty. Admiral Richardson received the news during a routine briefing at Naval Station Norfolk, his weathered face showing no emotion as he processed the implications of his officer's situation. Sullivan's personnel file was exemplary, with no history of excessive force or poor judgment that would suggest the incident was anything other than a justified response to a legitimate threat. But the admiral also understood the political realities that would influence any resolution. Colonel Antoneff used the first 24 hours after the incident to construct his narrative about American military arrogance and the danger of foreign security personnel operating on royal property. His version of events portrayed Sullivan as an unprovoked aggressor who had assaulted royal security personnel without justification, conveniently omitting the harassment and threats directed at Sarah Hartley that had precipitated the confrontation. The international media seized on the story with predictable enthusiasm, though early reports were confused and contradictory. Some outlets portrayed Sullivan as a hero who had protected an American citizen from foreign military harassment. Others focused on the diplomatic implications of an American officer striking members of a royal guard during a formal ceremony. The lack of clear information allowed various political perspectives to project their own interpretations onto the incident. Ambassador Hartley found himself in an impossible position as he attempted to balance his duty to protect American personnel with his responsibility to maintain diplomatic relationships. His initial reports to Washington emphasized the unprovoked nature of the Royal Guard's harassment and the justification for Sullivan's defensive actions. However, he was also acutely aware that Sullivan's fate might depend more on political negotiations than on the actual facts of the case. Sarah Hartley's role in the incident created additional complications for any potential resolution. Her father's position made her a political liability in any negotiation, while her status as an innocent victim made abandoning Sullivan's defense politically impossible for American officials. Her detailed account of the harassment and threats she had received provided crucial evidence of the guard's misconduct, but Colonel Antoneff dismissed her testimony as biased and unreliable. The kingdom's legal system provided for a military tribunal to address charges against foreign military personnel, but the composition and procedures of such tribunals were heavily weighted toward royal prerogatives. Sullivan's military counsel, a Navy Judge Advocate General officer who arrived from Washington, immediately recognized that any trial would be as much about politics as law. Behind the scenes, diplomatic negotiations began immediately as both governments sought to find a resolution that would allow them to save face while protecting their broader strategic interests. The trade agreement that had brought the delegations together represented years of careful negotiation worth billions of dollars in economic benefits. Allowing the Sullivan incident to destroy that agreement would serve no one's interests, but neither side could be seen as abandoning their principles for economic advantage. President Harrison's administration faced intense political pressure from military families and veterans organizations who viewed Sullivan's situation as a test of government commitment to protecting service members who act in defense of American citizens. Congressional leaders from both parties demanded immediate action to secure Sullivan's release, while also expressing support for his actions in protecting Sarah Hartley from foreign military harassment. The breakthrough in negotiations came from an unexpected source. Video footage from the palace security system, which Colonel Antonov had assumed would support his version of events, actually provided clear evidence of his subordinates' misconduct. The recordings showed Sergeant Kozlov's escalating harassment of Sarah Hartley, his physical assault when he grabbed her arm, and his attempt to draw a weapon against Sullivan. The footage made Colonel Antonov's claims of unprovoked American aggression impossible to sustain. Foreign Minister Petrov used the video evidence to broker a compromise that would allow both governments to claim victory while resolving the crisis. The kingdom would acknowledge that Royal Guard misconduct had precipitated the incident, while the United States would accept that Sullivan's response, though justified, had violated royal protocol. This framework allowed for Sullivan's release without admitting criminal wrongdoing while providing the kingdom with face-saving language about sovereignty and protocol. The formal resolution came after 6 days of intensive diplomatic negotiations. Sullivan would be released immediately and allowed to return to the United States without criminal charges. The kingdom would conduct its own investigation into Royal Guard misconduct and implement new protocols for handling diplomatic security issues. Colonel Antonov would be quietly transferred to a position where his particular talents would be less likely to create international incidents. Sullivan's release was coordinated to minimize media attention and political grandstanding. He was escorted directly from the palace to a military transport aircraft, avoiding the press conferences and public statements that both governments wanted to avoid. His first priority was a secure communication with Admiral Richardson, who congratulated him on his professional conduct under impossible circumstances. The personal cost of the incident became clear during Sullivan's debriefing sessions in Washington. While he had been officially vindicated and his actions deemed justified, the political sensitivity of the case made his continued effectiveness in diplomatic security assignments questionable. Military careers often survive combat injuries more easily than they survive political controversies, regardless of the officer's actual conduct or character. Admiral Richardson offered Sullivan several alternatives for his continued service, including positions that would utilize his security expertise without the diplomatic exposure that had created his recent difficulties. Sullivan chose to accept a training position at the Naval Academy, where he could share his experience with future officers without the political complications of active operational assignments. Sarah Hartley's academic research took an unexpected direction as she began studying the intersection of military protocol and diplomatic immunity based on her first-hand experience with both systems. Her account of the incident became part of her senior thesis on international law and military cooperation, providing a unique perspective on how abstract legal concepts affect real people in crisis situations. The trade agreement that had brought all the parties together was ultimately signed during a quieter ceremony 6 months later, with security arrangements that reflected lessons learned from the Sullivan incident. The economic benefits that both nations had sought were preserved, though the memory of those few minutes in the Crystal Ballroom served as a permanent reminder of how quickly diplomacy can give way to conflict when professional respect breaks down. Colonel Antonov's transfer to a remote border posting was announced as a routine personnel change, though diplomatic sources understood it as consequence for his orchestration of the confrontation. His rigid interpretation of royal prerogatives and personal hostility toward foreign military presence had nearly created a diplomatic crisis that could have damaged his country's relationships with important allies. Sullivan's story became part of unofficial military curriculum about the complexities of modern military service, where officers must navigate political sensitivities while maintaining their fundamental obligation to protect American citizens. His decision in the Crystal Ballroom was studied as an example of how personal courage and professional judgment can triumph over political expediency, even when the immediate consequences seem devastating. The lasting impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants. Diplomatic protocols for military security personnel were revised to prevent similar misunderstandings, while military training emphasized the importance of cultural sensitivity without compromising fundamental protective responsibilities. Sullivan's actions demonstrated that sometimes the right decision is also the difficult decision, regardless of career consequences or political complications. Years later, as Commander Sullivan addressed new classes of midshipmen at the Naval Academy, he would often reflect on those crucial moments in the royal palace. The lesson he emphasized was not about combat techniques or diplomatic protocol, but about the moral clarity that must guide military officers when they face situations where duty and political convenience come into conflict. The courage to do what is right, regardless of personal cost, remained the fundamental requirement of military leadership that no amount of political pressure could change.